Hey Ingrid, how you doing?
I'm doing good. How are you, Flo?
I'm pretty good. I'm pretty good. So, what are we doing this week, Ingrid?
Okay, so this is our eighth episode, and I think that would be interesting since neither of us are from the United States. I'm
Mhm.
from Brazil, Flo is from Australia, and I think it would be interesting for us to talk about how the Vampire Diaries would change if it were set in our respective countries. So, let's, I guess, think about cultural differences and just things that might be interesting. So a big change that we have already discussed is that the characters would be in college and not in high school. What does college look like in Australia?
Well, there are some differences. I mean, first of all, it's uni. It's like university. Here, we don't call it college. And also, the length of a bachelor
Mhm.
degree is completely different. So here, our degrees, if you're working full time, most of the time, a bachelor degree will be about 3 years, whereas in the US, it's 4. And from what I understand, the main source of that difference is just that in the US, they have all the like general courses in the first year. Like, it seems like some people even end up having to do this is my nightmare, my worst nightmare, to have to do maths and shit like that for an English major. Like, it doesn't really make sense to me. And also the kind of like gift that allows people in the US to be an undecided major. We don't have that. We have to like pick from the start, which I guess in the context of the Vampire Diaries throws a wrench in our Matt Donovan plans when we're trying to have him like kind of seesawing between different thoughts about what he wants to do, because you really do have to say you enroll in the specific bachelor and then even pick a major under the umbrella of that bachelor here. So, how do our bachelor degrees 3 or 4 years in Brazil? Or
It's interesting that you said that because bachelor degrees are 4 years in Brazil, usually.
mm,
We also have to pick like right from the start. We don't really have like this thing of
mm.
majors and minors. We just pick the bachelor course right from the start. So it's interesting that we have to do it for 4 years, even though we don't have like that period of time where we can, I guess,
Be
be
undecided,
undecided.
yeah.
Yeah.
This may just be specific to your degree, but from what I remember, you had to do like a big research project to complete your bachelor. Whereas we don't have to do that here. We don't have to do. You can choose sometimes to do units that are basically just a big kind of like a pseudo thesis, but you don't have
Mhm.
to. So maybe that's the difference: is that in your final year in Brazil, you're expected to do like a big research project, but whereas like here in Australia, they're like, "Nah, you're good. Just go. We've had enough of you."
Yeah, the research project would be the equivalent of a thesis. I
Mm.
guess an undergraduate equivalent of a thesis.
So that is every bachelor. They have to do like an undergrad thesis in Brazil.
Yes, that is everyone. So I have a background in education and like
Mm.
teaching of English as a foreign language, and it kind of encompasses like literature, linguistics, and a bunch of things. It's a complicated course that doesn't really have a direct translation in English,
Yeah.
but we do have to submit a paper at the end. So that's interesting. Oh my god.
Yeah.
You get to you stay for 3 years and you don't have to do the final paper.
Yeah.
That's
But
great.
yeah, we didn't have to do that. So does that mean that for TVD Brazil, they're going to have to do they're going to have to do these undergrad theses?
Yes, I think that would be like a big, that would be so
Mm.
interesting because it's usually a very, very stressful time. So basically, finals week only
A year or something.
lasting about 6 months, not a year, unless like
Yeah, so it's like
you,
a semester.
yeah,
Mm.
basically a semester. So the stress of finals week throughout an
Oh,
entire
I'm
semester.
shudder
So
I'm shuddering. I'm so sorry that happened to you, Ingrid. I'm so sorry that happened to you. That's so unfair. Do you feel like it helped you professionally in any way to have to do that?
it didn't help me in most professional senses
Mm.
because it's expected of everyone. But I think that I did get a lot of practice writing because you do it with an advisor, so there's someone there to give you feedback, and that's really good. But honestly, it wasn't that bad of an experience for me.
Mm.
The subject matter was interesting. It was a pretty good experience to have to do the paper, and you also have to present it. So that's another thing.
Oh,
Like you have to do like
oh
a
wow.
20 to 30 minute presentation on it. So yeah, but it wasn't that bad, honestly. I think maybe I repressed the memory, but I don't
You've
think it was
repressed
that
the
bad.
trauma. I think that there is something to be said for the fact that even a massive amount of work that's high pressure and it's a lot to do, if it's in a field that you're passionate about and that you're already thinking about, And especially if you're at the end of your degree and ready to step into working in that field professionally, like it's different. The kind of commitment and what it asks of you is different to, for example, like being in high school and trying to think about the amount of work that university will be and stressing out about that. It's just different when you're in it and you've
Mm-hmm.
actually been able to choose something that is important to you. Is different. So in the
Mm-hmm.
context of the Vampire Diaries, which we're forgetting to talk about because we're just like interested in each other's
Yeah.
lives, I think that it's interesting that in TVD Brazil they would have to, seek out advisors and really commit to this long term project and have very specific things that they want to look into. Like I think that provides an opportunity for, Bonnie as the history major, like what's she trying to figure out, and about the town or about its history, and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think just in my mind, it asks like a different kind of commitment from everybody, that could be potentially interesting.
It would be interesting to see like what their final year paper would be, what subject matter they would focus on. It's also interesting to think about if Rick
Mm.
survives, he would be like an advisor to one of these to one
Yeah,
of these students. So that would be
like Bonnie's
interesting.
advisor or some
Yeah,
shit.
and we kind of decided that Damon would be somehow involved as a teacher, like a theater drama
Oh my
teacher.
god.
So he would be an
Who would
advisor, and
Damon supervise?
that would be amazing, honestly.
Yeah, not even anybody like in the main cast he would necessarily advise, because
No
I
one
think
would
that,
pick him.
yeah, but like he would have students. Like,
Exactly. You'd have to juggle that. Yeah.
holy shit. Oh my god, that would be so funny. Like, we obviously need a very good, compelling reason for why he has to show up and do all that shit. Because, like, it's gonna make me pretty sad if he bails on all these people who are trying to get an education. It's like I want consistency from Damon. I want a situation that really fucks him up and forces him to
hmm
like sit his ass in a
Yeah.
chair and do shit
To
for
give
other people.
feedback to
Like,
like grade papers and stuff. Yeah.
yeah, imagine Damon going through his emails.
Yeah. There's a lot of exchanging emails of like you send the Word document of your
Yep.
most recent additions, and then they send it back with a ton of comments for you to change everything, and it's just that back and forth for 6 months.
Mm.
So, question: do you have to pay tuition at uni in Australia?
Oh,
Like,
yes. Good point. We have something for, I believe, citizens and I believe permanent residents, I think, can put all of their, like 100% of their uni fees on something called, I think it's currently called a HEX help debt, or sometimes there are different acronyms. And so all of your, I think the limit is 100,000 that you have that you can put on that. And you do still owe that to the government technically, but you don't have to start paying it back until you personally are earning over a certain threshold,
mm,
where that would be a reasonable expectation for you to pay it.
hmm
How
hmm
is it in Brazil?
the main difference, I think, and the most interesting difference is the fact that we have public universities here where
Ah.
tuition is free. So these are the most like prestigious universities because it's really hard to get in. And that's another point. In the final years of high school, there's like a big study culture. Like you have to cram, not cram, but like
Mhm.
you have to spend a lot of time studying. People do like courses to take the entrance exam and stuff. So it's it's definitely prestigious in the sense that it's very exclusive, but not exclusive monetarily. So access to universities became more common among the poor because of like
Mm.
affirmative action policies and private universities with student loan programs that are, I think, similar to the ones that you mentioned in Australia, where the government
Yeah.
pays for it and then you get to pay for it after, and it's a lot more reasonable than in the United States. So Matt and Vicky, if they wanted to, would definitely be able to go to college.
Mm.
100%. They would
That's
go.
It's interesting to me that the free option is extremely coveted and difficult to get into,
Mhm,
like, and merit based, but difficult to access, because I guess that mimics US scholarships at colleges and stuff like that. But
mhm,
also, for a whole institution to be either free or reasonably priced, the equivalent is like a city college in the US, which is considered, the way that that's treated is often as like lesser than the expensive Ivy League option. So it's like just interesting that policy differences and differences in the university structure changes the way that cultures speak about different things. Because can you imagine like a free university in the US? and how it would be discussed. I mean, I guess if it's structured the same as what you're talking about, like it would still be considered quite prestigious. But the way that we think about free education a lot of the time in Australia and in the US, like about 100% free, or the
It
more,
really is the exact opposite of the culture in the United States, where you have city colleges that aren't really, I guess the general opinion of them is very low, but the Ivy League is very prestigious.
yeah,
Whereas here, private universities sort of have a bad rap. Like there are very few of them that aren't predatory and basically DeVry, like that
yeah, yeah,
it's basically all of them are like that. So there's very
mm,
few where you say like you went to a private college, a private university, you'll be taken seriously, I guess,
yeah.
by the job market. But
That's interesting.
yeah, it's a double-edged sword because it is very exclusive.
Mm,
So for a long time, like people of color, Black Brazilians specifically, and poor people didn't really have access to public
mm-hmm.
universities, even though it was free, because they just couldn't get in.
Yeah,
It was so competitive that people really had to dedicate years of study specifically to pass the placement tests in order to get in. And when you, I don't know, work a part-time job,
mm.
you don't really have uh, that ability to dedicate so much time in
or
study.
or
Mhm.
your parents didn't go, you can't turn to them and ask them for advice on how to handle a study load
Yeah.
or what the answer to something is. Like I think that a lot of us, a lot of those of us who had parents who did go to do higher education don't really think about the fact that so much of what enabled us in the beginning especially, was being able to turn to them and
Hmm.
ask them. Like it was just the simple fact of, hey, how does this work? I'm really freaked out about it, I don't really understand
Yeah.
what's happening. And somebody who's like, yeah, that's okay, like
Mm.
sit down, we'll talk about it. It just makes a huge difference. So
Thankfully, the that has
yeah,
changed. Like there are more people from different
yeah,
backgrounds getting into university because of the government policies that were implemented in the 2000s mainly. So that changed for the better.
mm.
It's starting to change for the worse right now, but hopefully
Yep,
2022.
yep.
See it. See it.
Let's go.
Yeah. Let's continue.
It's actually the year. It's actually the year 3000, so we
Okay.
can say confidently that in 2022 everything turned around and
Yes.
everything was
Okay.
fine and nothing bad ever happened again.
Yes. Lula got reelected and everything was okay.
Everything is fine. So, what else were you thinking about major changes for TVD Brazil?
Let's think a little bit about location, just in general. How
Mm-hmm.
would being set in Australia make it different from being set in the United States and in Virginia specifically? Have you
Mm.
thought of a specific part of Australia that you think that TVD could be set in?
I think that what's interesting about TVD being set in Virginia is that, because I have never been to Virginia, so when I'm trying to think about what I understand about Virginia versus like and how to parallel that with Australia, obviously there's going to be crossed wires and things that aren't quite direct. But my impression of Mystic Falls is that it is a small town in a considerably rural area, that it's got quite deep class divisions that a lot of those kinds of small towns tend to have. And so I would imagine that anywhere in Australia really that's rural could have this kind of dynamic.
Mhm.
But I just weather wise, like just heat wise in Virginia, the equivalent is probably near the top of Australia, because obviously what's northernmost in Australia is hotter than what's southernmost because of where the equator is and stuff like that.
Mhm.
So I was thinking that the equivalent would probably be somewhere in North Queensland, in which case Mystic Falls would no longer be called, it would be called Mystic Falls on all the signs, but because of the way Australians shorten everything, it would probably be called Misto.
Misto. Oh,
Because
I love that.
no rural Australian is going to say Mystic Falls. They're going to say Misto. So that's like my big change.
I love that so much. That's great. Misto. That's fantastic.
Yeah. Up to Misto. Up to Misto. That's kind of how so far North Queensland is probably encapsulates a lot of Australian stereotypes that may not apply to a lot of people who live in more built up areas. Like I've lived in cities and in considerably rural areas, and I also have family members from North Queensland, and that's probably where the accents, the really thick Australian accents that you hear, come from far North Queensland. Like when you think about Crocodile Dundee versus Kate Blanchett, like that's what we're sort of talking about in terms of accent
Oh,
shifts.
interesting.
So they would all be the kind of like southerner US southerner equivalent in Australia, essentially, is what
Hmm.
I'm getting at. But it's quite difficult to translate because obviously there are several major differences. But how about you? Do you have any specific location in mind?
I think I had the same problem in trying to translate the I don't know, Southern American Virginia feel to Brazil, because I don't think we have much of an equivalent. Because, like,
Mm.
rural areas here are a bit different from the way that they seem to be in the United States and on the show, where either
Mm.
it's very poor and like very isolated, or it's a place where there's a lot of agribusiness. And so a lot of people are a lot of rich people because they own the land and they own like vast swaths of property where they can raise cattle or
Mm.
plant like soy or something like that. And so it's either one of those two extremes, and Mystic
Mm.
Falls doesn't really like fit into either
Yeah.
of those. It's just like, I don't know. I never really thought of it as too rural. It seemed to,
Mm.
I don't know. It seemed it's small town, but I didn't really think of it as rural because you don't really see like,
Yeah.
I don't know, people don't talk about farmland and crops
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
things like that, which is what I imagine when I think of a rural setting. But I don't know.
Mm. There's usually like, I guess, leak. A town doesn't just stop and then become an empty field. There's usually like outskirts and points where the town becomes gradually less and less built up as you kind of move into larger properties and then into like farmland. There's usually that kind of thing. But I felt like Mystic Falls was supposed to be quite small town, isolated, but also for the story, it always had exactly what they needed it to have. Like it
Mm-hmm.
always, if they needed to get something, they could always get it. I feel like the narrative wasn't necessarily fixed in place, except for the points about the Confederacy and Mystic Falls being in Virginia and those kinds of historical contexts. So
Yeah. Is there any, I guess, equivalent historical context or in Australia or something that you think would supplant the context of the Confederacy and of the Civil War if Mystic Falls were in Australia?
Australia has not had a civil war in the same way that the US has because we are still part of the Commonwealth at this point. So we haven't even tried to gain independence. We
My
haven't had a
condolences.
yeah, we haven't had a civil war like between specific groups within the country at any point because we are all kind of like the colonized group. The colonizer group is quite homogenous, and most of the aggression and the large scale conflict has been between typically white British settlers and Indigenous Australians. So there are places that have these deep conflicts in their history, but it's actually, for some of them, they're much more recent. There are several places, like I just this is an interesting point because this reaches a point where I'm probably not going to like sit here and theorize about how the Vampire Diaries would work with colonization in Australia because it's deeply ugly. It's very fresh, and I already find the way that the Vampire Diaries uses slavery and the Civil War to be distasteful, so it's quite difficult to imagine supplanting that. But Australia doesn't necessarily have the same history with the Civil War or with the kinds of slavery that was fought over. That was the central issue of the Civil War. We did have some slavery, but we were not participants in the transatlantic slave trade, so we didn't have
Mhm.
that kind of conflict. But yeah, it's difficult to imagine what it would look like. I think that handled as insensitively as the Vampire Diaries, it would probably just be a town somewhere in Australia, and random references to like random and occasional references for drama to pretty horrific things that happened to Indigenous Australians. There are locations in Australia where there were large scale massacres. There's just
Mhm.
like just the same. The country is spotted with the same kinds of ugliness that you'll find in most colonized countries or any country with a civil war in its history or any kind of attempted genocide like there has been here. So yeah, it's
Mhm.
pretty depressing and difficult to fit into a Vampire Diaries podcast. So I just don't think that it's a pitch fuel necessarily, but it's good to point out the similarities between US and Australia because we are so critical of the US on this podcast.
Yeah, it's important to be critical, but honestly, neither of our countries have any room to talk because
Yeah.
for the I found a similar situation with Brazil because our process of abolishing slavery was a bit different. It was later, and we had, I think, the biggest
Mm.
population of African slaves in the Americas. So,
Really, I didn't know that.
yeah,
Mm.
so it was more of a political transition rather than an actual civil war
Mm.
fighting for that. And we don't, I guess that it's interesting because so much of Mystic Falls and the Vampire Diaries is centered in its history and the connection that the characters have to the past of Mystic Falls, because so many of them, because they're vampires, were present at the time.
Mm.
And it's hard to find an equivalent in Brazil because there are very few cities where I would say, like, I can't think of any city that would have like a Founders Day
Mm.
parade or something, because I don't know if we would care enough, or if that would be, I don't know of any town that has as much pride in its history as Mystic Falls seemed to. And we didn't have a civil war in the same way as well as the United States, but we had like a very localized conflict in the around the same time, the 1890s, which, if Mystic Falls were to be set in that space, I think that you could draw some parallels, but like I don't know if I would feel
Mm.
comfortable doing that. So yeah.
So I guess that we are really arriving at the probably the most depressing point of the podcast, which is that the usage of specifically racialized hatred, it's so it feels so awful to try and consider how to utilize that in a narrative sense, because it's already a battleground. Here in Australia, we call it culture wars. I don't know if that exists. That term exists in many other places, but this war between how we interpret our past culture, and so we have this culture war already about the narrative and what happened. And so it's so hard to like. It's pretty fucked up to sit here and think about how you would build a story around this, because there are definitely many stories to be told that would be super interesting and fascinating, but I just don't. I could do all the research all the time, and I do not personally sitting here feel equipped to decide what that would look like. Feel like I'm knowledgeable enough about what that would look like. And when you use that as your central conflict, you'd want to understand it, right? You'd want to be coming from a position of knowledge. So it's just I don't understand how they did this. I
Mhm.
don't understand how they sat in a writer's room and discussed how the Civil War would work in their vampire TV show. I don't get it.
I think that even in a vampire TV show, I don't know if you could lean more in the horror aspect. I think it might have even worked, but
Mm,
they don't even have like black characters to, I guess, be protagonists of this part of
mm,
history that was so like fundamental to the black experience in the United States, to the African American experience. So it's just from the perspective of
mm-hmm.
the white Confederates, specifically like the Confederates, but just the white people involved in the conflict in
Yes.
general. So yeah, how did they do that? Why?
Yeah, we could sit here and talk about it for a very long time and still have the same
Uh huh.
conclusion.
I can't find a better transition. So
Yeah. Okay. So, are there any major festivals or anything that would be a part of TVD Brazil?
like I said, we don't really have Founders Day parades. We have a lot of holidays, but they're usually because of Catholic saints, or we
Mm-hmm.
have Independence Day and things like that.
Congratulations.
Yes, thank you. I'm so sorry that you guys don't have that. You're still part
Yeah.
of the Commonwealth. I've never stopped to consider that. My
Yeah.
deepest condolences. But we do have two events that, depending on the region of Brazil that would be set in, one of them would be more prominent than the other. But we have Carnaval, obviously, which is the one that
Mm.
everybody knows. That is a big thing in the southeast of Brazil and a little bit in the northeast in the state of Bahia, not so much in the other places. But we do have, like, besides the samba schools in Rio and Sao Paulo, we have like street parties where people just kind of dress up in costumes, lots of glitter, and just to go out on the street, have parades, listen to music, drink. So I think that could be interesting.
Sounds awesome.
Yes, it is. It's pretty fun. It's pretty nice. The other big festival that is more of a part of northeastern Brazilian culture is São João, which means like Saint John Festival, which is a harvest festival
Oh.
related to the corn harvest specifically. So I think that would fit a bit more to the context of Mystic Falls and the, I don't know, I don't know why. But yeah, there's also this harvest festival where people have parties and eat food that is made of corn
Mm.
and just drink and have fun. So
Mm.
those are the two main ones. There's also like Parintins, which is something from the north of Brazil, but I don't know enough about it
Mm.
to talk about it because it's something that's more related to the indigenous populations of Brazil. So
Mm.
I honestly don't know enough about it to talk about it. But those are the two, and I imagine Caroline having to organize like a Carnaval street party or a São João
Uh,
party. I think that would be very fun.
I just want to mention that on the originals, they do have something. I don't know if they call it a harvest festival or just a harvest ritual, but the witch community will basically assign 4 teenage girls, usually. They will like confer this power on them and then sacrifice them all on an altar by slitting their throats, and
Oh,
that's what they
okay.
call the harvest ritual, and then they come back to life. So that's that. There's a harvest
Interesting.
ritual, but I don't believe
Mm-mm.
that there is any kind of festival. But the originals is like it has a festival every few episodes, and I just think it cements it. It feels like it happens in the place that it happens more than TVD. I don't know how to explain that. It feels like it's very. I mean, I've never been to New Orleans, and I imagine that there's lots of things about the originals that is just not accurate, like the fact that
Mm-hmm.
all the main characters are white and all the black characters are side characters. But it's yeah, it just the amount of festivals is like pretty wild. Here in Australia, I don't think we don't really have anything that you would go out on the street to celebrate necessarily, other than Pride. There's nothing that I'm aware of that people would flock the streets in order to do or necessarily have a big block party. Sometimes you would go over to somebody's house to celebrate Australia Day specifically, but Australia Day is quite contentious. It essentially celebrates the first arrival of what we call the First Fleet, and so there's a lot of debate around whether or not we should be changing that date to because if we're celebrating all of Australia, including Indigenous Australians, we should not be celebrating the day that colonization started. There's a lot of other different milestones that we could zero in on to be more cohesive and more respectful of what colonization meant for them, and
Mm-hmm.
probably something that we that's a little bit lighter that we do have a lot and that's not fixed to a date is we have a lot of sausage sizzles, which is what we call like
Sausage sizzles.
yeah, it's what we call you cook some sausages and you just have them on bread, and sometimes you will have them often you'll have them with onion, it's like fried up onions, and any sauce that you want. We don't do a lot of mustard, but you'll always find ketchup, which we call tomato sauce, and barbecue sauce.
Okay. I find it fascinating that you have like a whole event surrounding like hot dogs. That's
Yeah,
incredible. That's pretty cool.
so TVD Australia would be very into sausage sizzles.
Mm-hmm.
It's funny to imagine Caroline trying to arrange one because it feels not glamorous enough for her somehow. But she would be like, I love that we're just like every time
Mm-hmm.
there's some kind of festival or something, we want to see Caroline organize it. We want to see that
Yes, I want to see
montage.
Caroline in that context. Yeah, I don't think the corn harvest festival would be glamorous either.
Mm,
I think she would make it glamorous though. Like
yeah.
people eat a lot of corn. There are a lot of like traditional dishes using corn, and people wear a lot of plaid and gingham.
Oh, that's cute.
We I don't really know why. So I think that she would be very like adamant about people wearing costumes and wearing gingham and straw hats and things like that. So it's a whole thing.
Yeah.
Not as cool as sausage sizzles, I don't think, because I don't really like corn. So it's not one of my favorite holidays, but
Yeah.
it's a thing. There's a lot of fire too. Oh, that could be a
Oh,
problem.
yikes.
The vampires. Oh, that's interesting because we this is something that isn't so common anymore because of like health reasons.
Mm.
The smoke would be very detrimental to anyone's lung health, but typically you would set bonfires in front of your house or um, at a party at an event. You would have like a bonfire and people would jump over it.
Oh no.
Uh, just imagining the vampires in that situation. A lot of wood.
Mm.
Wood could be formed into stakes in that party. I think that would be an interesting context to like kill someone.
Terrifying for a vampire. For obvious reasons, in Australia, we don't have a real big fire culture with like starting and celebrating
Mm.
fires because they tend not to be. Well, this is true of Brazil as well, with the burning in the Amazon, but
Mm-hmm.
we tend not to. And basically, all of summer, you're just not allowed to set a fire on purpose. And if you do, you're in so much trouble. Like,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, but it's weird
Yeah.
that you mentioned that we have this part of our culture where there are like forest fires commonly here, and it's
Mm.
really bad. So yeah, interesting. Never thought of that. It's not so common anymore. Yeah.
Was there anything else you wanted to chat about on festivals?
I don't think so. Just maybe one thing that is very common here in places where we don't have beaches, because like Brazil is not all beaches. It's a big country, even though people think of like, oh,
Devastating.
pristine
My
beaches.
vision of
Yeah,
Brazil is shattered.
devastating. I know. But what a lot of people will do is to like bathe in rivers or in reservoirs of water that are like supposed to have like to keep fresh water so people can drink because in the
Mm.
northeast of Brazil, droughts are very common. Not that so common, but yeah, they're pretty common. But people will kind of have like beach parties around these reservoirs, and it's kind of like it's a big part of small town northeastern Brazil culture that I think would be an interesting translation, I guess. So if you can imagine like those, I don't know, any party where the kids are just like drinking and having
Mm.
fun, and
Like watering hole
I don't
stuff,
know,
I think
not
that they've
specific.
done a few times. Yeah. Mm.
Yeah, basically like that.
Yeah. I think it's like,
But that's it.
yeah.
That's all I got.
Well, that's a lot. I think it's interesting to think about what 20s, early 20 somethings would be up to in 2009, like where they're partying and where they're, hanging out and stuff like that. And I think that
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of parallels.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of tangentially related to festivals, I guess, and also to like sausage sizzles, obviously, is food. I think that a lot of Australian food is quite similar to US food, although I have people who've gone to the US and have said that there's even sugar in the milk, which is not the case here. But food here is, in general,
Mm.
we we do sausage sizzles and we do like mostly food that you would find in America.
Here in Brazil, we I can't really think of any food that would be interesting to put
Mm,
on the show. I guess it's just because I'm immersed in this culture, so I don't really think of anything like specifically that would be different or like worth mentioning besides all the corn,
mm.
I guess.
Yeah.
We have like regional fried foods that are pretty good, depending on like where you are. So if it were set in the Northeast, we could have like in Bahia they have what's called acarajé, which is like fried. It's made from like beans that are mashed and
Mm.
fried, and you can put shrimp or whatever you want in it. But usually people put like shrimp or seafood, and apparently it's really good. I've never tried it, and it's apparently really spicy. But I honestly can't think of any food
Yeah,
that.
it's hard. It's hard to take an outsider perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Something that I came across as I was, this thing didn't have. It didn't have this note didn't have anywhere to go. Like I don't know if it's location specific, and it's not like it's definitely not food, but
Mm-hmm.
there's in Australia and in particular in anywhere rural where you're walking through lots of trees and stuff like that, we have this concept called, this is something that we tell tourists and it's not true. And I'm going to be drawn and quartered in the town square for saying this in public on a podcast and ruining the game. But we tell tourists that we have something called drop bears, which are essentially evil koalas that drop out of trees and like eat your face off.
I love
Yeah,
it.
so TVD Australia, every single character would be very very much in on this idea of drop bets, and we do sometimes try and tell children in Australia that they're real. And part of what I thought was interesting about them is because when I was told about them once at school when I was younger, it was in the context of also discussing a similar creature in Indigenous Australian beliefs. Interesting creature that is kind of vampiric, actually. So I just wanted to bring this up.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a red frog like creature. Hang on, I'm actually going to look it up to find the legit name because I know that this is real because I was, unless this is something that Indigenous Australians tell us, white Australians, it's like they're drop
It's
bears.
their drop bear. When you said that, I immediately thought like, let's make it real on the show, and the koalas are vampires.
Yes.
Like instead of bats,
Why
it's
can't
just that.
animals become vampires? I don't think it's fair that it's just humans. Like animals should be able to be vampiric. You should be able to turn your dog and make him live forever. So the name of these creatures, according to Wikipedia, is the Yara Ma Yahu. I believe that's how it's pronounced, but there isn't like a pronunciation guide here. So apparently they resemble a little red frog-like man with a very big head, a large mouth, with no teeth, and suckers on the ends of their hands and feet. And so they drop out of fig trees and they like attack you and suck your blood through the
That's
like little
fantastic.
suckers on their hands and feet. Which I just think that's so cool.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
That's amazing. Yeah, that's amazing. Do we? Trying to think if we have
yeah.
an equivalent figure in Brazilian folklore. I guess that I'm kind of drawing a
Do
blank.
you guys have a lot of the same like vampiric myths? Like, does that tend to exist in Brazilian media and that kind of thing? Like, in the same sense that it does in a lot of US and British and Australian media?
Yes, because I think that most of our exposure to vampires comes from that media. We don't necessarily have like a figure that is vampiric in the same way that many cultures do. As far as I know, like there could be some sort of vampiric figure in like indigenous beliefs or things like that, but most of what we think of as vampires come from like European
Yeah.
folklore and like the American adoption and adaptation of that. So
Yeah.
nothing I can think of in
Yeah,
particular.
I think it's interesting because like I often hear this idea that every culture has a version of the vampire and that sort of thing. And I guess I feel
Mhm.
like the word vampire brings so much baggage with it that that can't possibly be true. And that it's really more that every culture plays around with this idea of consuming the body or the blood in the body, and every culture plays around with the idea of death and undeath. And then because those are two of these core principles in the European idea of vampires, we then say every culture has a version of the vampire. But I struggle with that a bit because like feels like a Joseph Campbell kind of observation about other cultures and their stories and mythology and not
Mhm.
mythology but belief systems and stuff like that.
Mhm. I googled this. I looked it up, and apparently there's a figure that's not from indigenous beliefs. It's more like an urban legend where it's a vampire that wears all leather. Because here in Brazil and in the Northeast in particular, there is apparently a figure that is a vampire and wears like all black leather, and it's called encorado, which basically means like he who wears leather, like the guy wearing leather, I guess.
Damon Salvatore.
But it's Damon Salvatore. But it's interesting because in the northeast of Brazil, we had a very strong presence of cangaceiros, which were a group of like outlaws, very much in the like social banditry sense, where they were, I guess, I wouldn't say like political revolutionaries, but there is that sense of like going against the status quo, not just from a perspective of trying to make money, but also to change the situation socially. So he basically dresses like that, only all black, because the cangaceiros would wear like all leather, and that's interesting. Okay, is this a real thing? I'm going to look this up because I don't see many sources of this.
Yeah, that's interesting, and I and I do think that if TV de Brazil was set in the same area, that Damon Salvatore would probably fall within this archetype.
He's
If
the origin of the urban legend.
yes, oh, that's so funny.
I love it so much. I'm going to look this up, and if there's nothing about this, I will create it. I'm going to make a D&D character out of this. This is amazing, actually. I'm learning so much about my own culture. Okay.
At what point in this Vampire Diaries podcast do we turn this into TV and D, which is when we're just
TV&D?
like rolling these characters and and figuring things out in a very D&D
I think
fashion.
it should be right now. I think it should have been episode 1.
I should have
Honestly.
we should have had the pun ready to go, locked and loaded. TV and D.
Yeah. TV&D. Oh, that would have been fantastic. But
The vampires and
yeah,
dragons.
vampires and dragons.
Excellent.
There's like a adventure module, I guess, in the D&D universe that's published by Wizards of the Coast, which is the company that owns Dungeons and Dragons, called The Curse of Strahd. So there is D&D vampires, and it's very interesting. But yeah,
Sounds wild.
anyway, another tangent
Yes.
to talk about Dungeons and Dragons. I'm sorry, it's the brain rot.
A tangent for another day. Do we need to do a Dungeons and Dragons dedicated episode?
I would, but
Are you scared to unleash that kind of power in yourself?
yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm scared of what would happen.
Yeah. Okay, so I think that's all of our like major stuff covered, I believe.
Mm-hmm. The point that I want to end on is that in Brazil we do have a very strong union presence for like most trades and most professions.
Congratulations.
So I would say,
I'm very happy for you
yes,
guys.
I would say that the employees of the Mystic Grill would have a very strong union, and that the union would be like a fundamental part of the town. Like instead of the town council, it would be the Mystic Grill union.
Yes,
I think that'd be great.
excellent. I love that. Thanks for hanging out with me today, Ingrid.
Thank you so much, Flo. It was a great time, as always.